The title of my sermon this morning is Give Yourself a Break. The topic is self-forgiveness. Her name was Lori Bolter. And as it happened, she was the granddaughter of the head camp director. She was a fairly large girl, about 14 at the time. And as fate would have it, she slept in the top bunk. I slept in the bunk below. This was the first of her 8-week stay. And she was just settling in for another fantastic summer at sleepover camp. But that's not what happened. Rest period had ended, and with one big leap from the top bunk, she jumped to the floor. The rest is something of a blur. I remember hearing the counselor saying, "Call the ambulance. We've got to call the ambulance." And I remember the floor looking as if it had been coated with fresh red paint. In what seemed like an eternity, the emergency vehicle arrived, and Lori was rushed off to the hospital. I saw her one more time after that. Using her crutches, she came hobbling back to say goodbye. Her foot was in a humongous cast, and all of us fellow campers signed it while wishing her luck, crying as only teenage camper girls can cry, and telling her to promise to come back next year. What had happened was that she had landed barefoot on someone's tennis can, and it had sliced her up pretty badly. In the fracas, I remember one camper had asked whose tennis can it was, and no one answered. Was it because the others didn't know, or because they didn't care? Which? That question hounded me for the better part of the summer, because I knew the answer. It was mine. I hadn't put it away in its designated spot. I just left it right where it was as I came in from the tennis court and before I dove into my lower bunk for a chance to nap. And for several weeks, I could think about little else. The activities that I had lived for each summer came to feel like torture. Sailing, Lori wouldn't get to go. Swimming, Lori couldn't swim. Archery, Lori couldn't enjoy it, so why should I? And when I wasn't thinking about sports in my youthful fantasy, I was thinking about a potential lawsuit. Would they sue me? Had Lori figured out that I was to blame? Had she told her parents? And were my parents going to be receiving a bill for a 10-day hospital stay? A stay they knew nothing about? Finally, when I could stand it no longer, I went to see the assistant camp director named Grace. Not the head, not Lori's grandmother. I wasn't that courageous. But it was Grace I went to see, Grace and I, who had a long talk as we walked along the lakeshore of Lake Sylvia in Annandale, Minnesota. And it was Grace I asked if I might be allowed to go home. I wanted to punish myself, and that was the best way that I could think of to do it. I would write Lori a letter of apology, explain what I had done to my cabin mates, pack my bags, and wait for my parents to drive the 2 hours it took to arrive at the camp. But Grace, appropriately named, would not accept my resignation. She told me instead to simply wash away my tear stains and then to wash up for supper. And then she said these words I have never forgotten. She said, "You know, I was a mother to 4 sons. But had I ever had a daughter, I would have wanted her to be like you. Consider yourself fully confessed, and now for your sake and for Lori's, just go have the best summer she could imagine." That day, Grace for me was like God with skin on, as she taught me the meaning of self-forgiveness. Someone has said that self-forgiveness is the most difficult feat there is to accomplish. Last year, I asked Lance Pearson, who had been incarcerated 17 years, if he would preach a 3-part series of sermons. And the first, you remember, was on freedom, the meaning of freedom, written by someone who knew well the cells of prison. It was an amazing sermon, and over 1,000 people tuned in on the internet to hear what he had to say. And his next sermon I said, "Would you preach on forgiveness?" And again, he poured out his soul and talked about how he had, in fact, learned to forgive. But the third part was to be on self-forgiveness. And that part, he said, he wasn't ready to give. He said, "That's the hard one, and I'm not there yet." It is hard. And how do we go about it? We know that self-inflicted amnesia does not work. I know about that. I've tried it. I can forget lots of things, but not the things I want to forget. So what do we do? What does the Bible say? Interestingly enough, Scripture says absolutely nothing about self-forgiveness. In fact, there's not one single verse in either the Old or the New Testament that says anything about how to forgive oneself. That's because, biblically speaking, forgiveness is always relational. It's not a solitary activity. It's something that we can only receive either from other people or from God himself. But we cannot manufacture it. I'm quoting here, someone said, and I like this quote, "One cannot forgive oneself any more than one can kiss oneself." How's that for stating it like it is? In other words, in order to forgive ourselves, we need to accept forgiveness from someone else. As I did from Grace, as the Native American did from the victim's family, as Peter did from Jesus. But if that's not possible, if there is no one who functions as God with skin on, then most importantly, we have to receive it from God. God himself. But the acceptance of forgiveness is up to us. God's forgiveness is a given. It is both ongoing and unconditional. And to quote one theologian, we are forgiven whether we like it or not. How we respond to God's offer is up to us. The message? Give yourself a break. Amen.